Good morning.
Hi. Good afternoon here.
Oh, yes, that's true. We're 3 hours
Yep,
apart.
yep,
Well,
that's right. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm sitting in the beautiful sun next to the water. I figured I'd
Awesome.
really do some drama for you.
This is perfect because
Yep.
today we're talking with Dr. Sara Spike about Canadian coastal history. And do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. I'm a cultural historian of rural communities and coastal environments in Atlantic Canada in particular. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton right now. And my postdoctoral project is a cultural history of fog in Atlantic Canada, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit.
Yes. So, why I invited you to speak today is that you recently guest edited a series on coastal history for us, and I think that it's going to continue as long as people want to submit things, correct? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted you to kind of define, how do you define coastal history? And what do we learn from this specific environment, this specific landscape that we don't learn from other landscapes?
Yeah, sure. So for me, the idea of coastal history, I think, is an opportunity to think about the specific um, cultures and social formations and political formations that emerge in relationship with this very particular ecology. And it's a way, I think, a really interesting way of linking communities around what is currently known as Canada, often quite marginal communities that aren't necessarily at the center of conversations often. Um, it's a way that actually links those communities into a sort of shared history, and that also links those same sort of marginal communities to communities around the globe. So it has a very specific coastal history can have a really specific place-based local perspective, but it also has a really transnational, I think, perspective that connects communities and experiences and social formations and cultures that yeah, as I say, that aren't necessarily always at the center of conversations. I think links them more broadly and creates a broader context for understanding those kinds of cultures and those places. I also think coastal history has a particular potential for a particular kind of urgency right now. Coastal communities in the time of climate crisis are disproportionately affected by climate change, by changes in ocean temperature, sea level rise, increase in major um, weather events on the coast, coastal erosion, all of these issues, ice, melting ice, all of these are felt disproportionately and first in coastal communities. So there's a kind of
Mhm.
urgency to look at these places in a contemporary context, but also, as historians, then we also want to think about the past of those same places. So I feel like coastal history is maybe not a thing. It's not a set of methodologies necessarily, but I think it's a lens to think about some places that maybe need our attention right now, and which maybe haven't always been the center of attention in the past.
Mhm. I really love the focus on the communities that actually live on the coasts because I
Mm-hmm.
think in popular culture or in a lot of media, we kind of focus on the people who visit the coast,
Yep.
where it's
Yep.
a place of leisure. And even with myself as a park historian, that's how we think of parks often. And I really
Yeah. Yeah.
love thinking about the people who actually live near parks, the people who actually live on these coasts and
Yep.
make a living there and work there. Um, so you, as I mentioned, edited this series for NiCHE,
Mm-hmm.
has some really great pieces in it. I was wondering if you'd want to tell us a bit about what people can learn about Canadian coastal history from I can't say specific, but I keep trying to, this series.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that interests me about coastal history is I always ask the question of how did you arrive at the coast? So for scholars, how did you, in your scholarly sort of trajectory, how did you end up at the coast? And for um, for a lot of people, it's that they were maritime historians and were thinking about um, shipping, or thinking about the lives of sailors, or thinking about um, navies, or things like that, and then realized, and this has been going on for a long time. Judith Fingard's sort of classic Jack Import, and the whole sort of um, historiography about sailor towns, for instance, um, is is sort of the beginning of what we could call coastal history, thinking about um, what happens when those sailors come ashore, and what is the particular sort of social arrangements that emerge in this sort of liminal transitional space, this kind of unusual um, kind of landscape between land and sea. So that's one way that people end up at the coast, is from the sea. Another way often is through urban history. People who are interested in cities end up studying cities that are on the coast, and then start to think about what that means, that this city is situated on the ocean, and how that specific ecology and that specific um, sort of relationship of transnational mobility, for instance, um, characterizes that city. And then there's maybe a third, there's probably more than three, but a third way to arrive at the coast is my own way of arriving at the coast, which is as a rural historian, and trying to broaden the idea of what rural history is beyond a sort of agricultural lens, to think about uh, coastal small communities as nevertheless inherently rural, and how do we make sense of the the particular arrangements and relationship to the environment that is apparent in these rural communities, that is not represented in the sort of typical understanding of rural history as an agricultural focus. So what I wanted to do with this series is invite people looking at coasts from a bunch of different perspectives. So we have one paper that's about the ports in the port of Vancouver, and the sort of disorderly social arrangements of the urban waterfront. We have a paper that's about from a geographer, from a social science perspective, about um, licensing regulations on the BC fisheries. We have a couple of papers that are more kind of cultural history, looking at um, uh, mapping, and the sort of idea of how do we represent coasts, how do we represent a sort of fluid boundary in a linear sort of fashion on paper. This is a really important paper, I think, by archaeologist Mike O'Rourke, about coastal erosion along the Beaufort Sea, and the threats to enuvolute cultural communities in the north, and cultural heritage sites, particularly in the north, as coastal erosion increases, and then also a paper about sort of diplomacy and international relations, and how the sort of fluid margins of um, watery international borders can create interesting kind of political relationships as well. So there's all kinds of things, and I really wanted it to be uh, a, a set of very different perspectives and different kind of ideas, but they all link these communities all around this sort of giant territory, with an interest in how humans interact with and sort of make sense of these particular ecologies and particular environments that they're living in or situated in.
I want to thank you for putting this together, because I definitely learned a lot. I read Kate Bauer's piece on Mackay Seal Island, which is
Mm-hmm.
about diplomacy and, is it
Yep.
Canadian, is it American? And then I went on Instagram and I was posting a photo from that article, and then I went to
Mm-hmm.
geotag it. And there's an option for it to be in Maine, and there's an option for it to be in New Brunswick.
Oh,
And I thought
amazing,
that was kind
amazing.
of
That's really
a
funny.
perfect little example of how this is still a thing.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
your own piece in this series is called "A Salubrious saline exhalation,
Mhm.
fog and health in colonial Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So I just want why did you begin to research fog, and what does it tell us about Canadian history?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the short answer is I grew up in the fog. I grew up with fog, as most people in Atlantic Canada grew up with fog. Everyone here has stories about fog, but the, the that doesn't necessarily mean that I was always gonna study it. But as I was working on my uh, PhD dissertation, I was working on a chapter about lighthouses and about coastal navigation, and fog was coming up a lot in that. And I was seeing in those just the little bits that I was reading these really evocative um, representations of fog and really key kind of like sensory relationships with fog that were being expressed in these really clear, um, very interesting ways. And I really articulate ways, and it just seemed like there might be an interesting body of kind of sources to work with, and so I started accumulating, to see if there was something there, and I found, just a really remarkable sort of archive of people telling stories about fog, or people trying to make sense of fog, people living with fog and trying to express what it felt like to live with this presence around you on a regular basis. And um, yeah, I've been really fortunate to be able to kind of pull together enough material that it feels like potentially, well, I'm hoping to be a book project about various aspects of sort of life with fog in Atlantic Canada, essentially. So from the sort of early colonial period up to the 20th century. And there's, a number of different perspectives that will show up in different chapters, but there's a lot of really, really just evocative, just filled with sensation. I think that was really the kind of key that drew me in. I'm really interested in sensory history and how people in the past experienced their environments in an embodied sort of way, and for whatever reason, people have very uh, articulate responses to fog that they thankfully for historians have written down. So so I have this body of stuff that I'm gonna work through and try to pull together into a book. So the essay that I wrote about health and fog is just a tiny little fragment of that much larger project. But those are the kinds of, you can see the sources in there where these sort of visitors to the coast are trying to make sense of what this entity is, what this fog is, and for them at that time it was even more mysterious because they didn't have um, the kind of scientific theory at their disposal to actually even understand what it was. And so they're trying to make sense of why these fogs were not killing people, why these fogs were so healthy, when their experience in Europe was that fogs were associated with miasma and with death and with decay and with illness. And so it's a, I think, a really neat example of how uh, sort of settler colonialism works. Really, how the visitors have these experiences of difference, these sort of shocking experiences of difference, and then they kind of incorporate those experiences into a worldview that justifies the transformations that go along with settler colonialism. So these are healthy fogs, and so that is a reason to encourage settlement and a reason to encourage people to move to Newfoundland or to Nova Scotia in this case.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a fascinating article. I love how it kind of connects the environment to the history of health and medicine and emotions, the emotionality and
Mm-hmm.
sensory. And as you mentioned, that's really wonderful. And I like how that you mentioned that it's kind of like a personal, I grew up with this, so it's in my mind. And when I think of historians who really like um, exude a love for the landscape that they study, like you are at top of the list. And
Yeah.
you just I love the care that you take in the research that you do. I think it's really beautiful and lovely. And if people want to follow you and keep up with this, you can follow Sara on Twitter at Sara_Spike. Um, and I'm sure we'll have more about coastal histories on our site soon. And I just want to thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much, Jessica. This is such a great initiative. These little conversations that you're
Yes,
doing, and
yes,
um,
thank
yeah, I
you.
really love it. And thank you so much for inviting me to be one of the first ones. This has really been great. And there is another coastal history post that's coming up at the end of September that's already in the pipeline, so you can watch out for that
Yeah,
as well. Thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
Bye.
Bye.